This is Chanel.
Hi, I'm Chanel. I'm president of the Parasitology Cluster.
And we are introducing Dr. Menzies and Dr. Peregrine for their talk on Bluetongue. I would give you more information, but I think I'm going to let them take it from here.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, and welcome to the joint meeting. And so I'm Dr. Menzies, and I teach in the ruminant health management group, small ruminants. And this is Dr. Peregrine, who needs no introduction. He's a parasitologist. But I'd really like to introduce two other people in our audience. One is your new dean, Dr. Jeff Wichtel from PEI. And Dr. Wichtel is a ruminant field service clinician as well, and he really likes sheep, so that makes him very high in my estimation, as well as yours. And just as important, Dr. Jocelyn Jansen, who's our species veterinarian at OMAFRA. What's your official title, Jocelyn?
Small ruminant veterinarian.
Okay, in vet science and policy, and her office is up in Elora. And so when you guys get into practice and you are running into a situation and it looks like you really need help, well, you can call me, but you can also call Jocelyn, and she's awesome. So anyway, so we're going to start to talk about a little overview of Bluetongue. It's going to be a bit political.
A bit.
So, Dr.
Okay,
Peregrine, take
thanks,
it away.
Paula. Folks, just so you know, this is being recorded because there probably is some interest externally. When we discussed this issue of it being recorded, we did ask ourselves, do you think this might tone down some of the things we could say? Paula and I decided it wouldn't have any impact whatsoever. So as we go along, please feel free to ask questions if anything's unclear. It's a very hot topic, particularly in this part of Canada at the moment. What we wanted to do is talk to you about this particular disease that suddenly appeared in Ontario, transmitted by an arthropod vector, so a tiny small fly called Culicoides, and it produces a disease, the viral infection, produces a disease that's referred to as Bluetongue. How blue are the tongues? I'll let Dr. Menzies come back to. Just as an introduction to this, first question we're going to ask you is, what did the CFIA find in Ontario last month? But before I answer that, I want to ask you a question, and that is, if you're a large or a small ruminant producer in Ontario, what one disease would fill you with horror if it was diagnosed on your farm? What one disease? It's not Bluetongue. What one disease, if you suddenly had diagnosed on your farm, would you think was going to be the end of your life? Yes. Foot and mouth disease. I think most people would probably say that. Why would you think that? Because it's a reportable disease. Any other reasons? Why do you think it could be horrendously bad? What are some of the reasons? Anyone? Some people, yes. Highly infective. It is. Ironically, I lived in East Africa for 12 years and saw a lot of it. Rarely does it make animals, rarely does it kill animals. All right, but it does have an impact on production and probably would have a big impact on milk production. But the other issue is that it's on a list of diseases that are called diseases of trade. And they are put together by this organization. Whoops.
Uh-oh, I got the wrong one up there.
Hang on, Dr. Mann. Do you know where it is, Paula?
We'll find it, don't worry.
We'll find it. So the organization that's based in France is called the OIE, the Office International des Epizooties. It's the World Animal Health Organization. And our chief veterinary officer goes over to Paris every year, meets with the chief vet officers of every other country around the world, and they decide what diseases should be on that list. Foot and mouth disease is on that list. BSE, mad cow disease, is on that list. It's a disease of trade because those diseases are on that list because of what happens when they get diagnosed, the national border gets closed. So you no longer can export to disease-free areas, parts of the world. Did you find it, Paula?
Yep, no problem.
Oh, excellent.
There you go.
So there's the Culicoides, there's the Bluetongue, all right? And this is the organization, all right? So foot and mouth disease, BSE is on that list. I don't know if you're aware, when BSE got diagnosed in Alberta, just a handful of cases resulted in closure of the border, and the impact on Canadian agriculture was probably around about $2 billion. Bluetongue is also on that list. It's a disease of trade, all right? And for many years, we've been considered Bluetongue free. And that was great, all right? Because it meant we could export to not only Bluetongue positive countries, such as the US, but we could also import to Bluetongue free countries all around the world. However, to retain that status, you have to prove you're free of it. So for many years, you might not be aware, we have, just so you know, the duck means I'm talking. This is how Dr. Menzies said, now you'll know which slide you're talking about. So to prove we're still free of Bluetongue, every year, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency arranges for the collection of a random sample of blood samples from cattle across Canada. And we have to screen 3,000 cows every year to prove we're still free of it. So that's what we've been doing for many years, and we've stayed free until August the 7th. All right, so 2 months ago, or just under 2 months ago, all right, on August the 7th this year, what happened? Well, one cattle beast that was slaughtered in southern Ontario, so one of those random 3,000 animals, tested positive. All right, so what happened? So it tested positive on this antibody ELISA that's used for routine screening, and that was immediately confirmed by the CFIA using a different test, which also showed that it was what's called serotype 13. Paula's going to tell you about the virus that causes this, but there's a large number of different serotypes. 13 is a North American serotype, and the significance of that she'll explain in a minute. That just proves there's the presence of antibody, all right? Remember, we were free of it, all right, until this point, theoretically. They also looked for the presence of viral DNA in the blood using a PCR method, and it was negative. So it was antibody positive, but there didn't appear to be any evidence of active infection. So where did that cow come from? This information is all publicly available. I checked yesterday. It came from a beef farm in Chatham, Kent, and a beef farm where none of the animals have been imported from anywhere else in the world. They'd all been reared on that farm. So that was one positive animal. The CFIA immediately went out there. It's a month later. Things don't always move quickly in CFIA. All right, but a month later, they went back to that farm to work it up. They'd collected blood samples from 42 animals, 2 out of 42, so now there's a total of 3 off that farm, all right, were seropositive, had antibody to Bluetongue virus. All of them were negative for the presence of viral DNA. So there was just antibody, but there appeared to be no active infection. Immediately at that point, Canada lost its Bluetongue-free status. So we immediately, this is the CFA statement, loss of Bluetongue-free status in Canada means immediate suspension of export certificates for live animals, semen, and embryos. That's basically any ruminant or any ruminant product until certificates can be negotiated with trading partners. Paula, there's a sheep, which means
I'm the sheep. Yeah, it's me now. So what exactly is Bluetongue, the disease? So it's caused by a virus. It's an orbovirus. And worldwide, there's 24 different serotypes, although there's now just recently been one in Hungary identified, and they can't serotype it. So maybe there's 25. But in the US, there are 5 serotypes which are considered endemic to the western and southwest states. They've been around since the 1950s. There are other strains in the southeast which kind of came from the Caribbean. And you'll understand why this is really important in a second. So the virus is pathogenic to sheep and to white-tailed deer. And less so to goats. Goats can get a fever, but it's not, these strains, these 5 are not considered pathogenic to cattle. Cattle get infected, but they usually don't suffer any clinical disease.
Can I just add to that? And so
Yeah.
all the cows that were tested on that farm, both the positives and the negatives, appeared completely healthy.
Yeah, there was no report of any illness on the farm. And this again is important. We'll say why later. So in sheep and white-tailed deer, what does this virus do? It causes damage to the endothelium of blood vessels, causing a severe vasculitis, and you can imagine that you can get leakage of plasma and so on, necrosis of the tissues if there's not enough blood supply to them, and so all the clinical signs are related to that, and they can be pretty dramatic. We know that sheep, it's not really horizontally transmitted from cattle to sheep, not well transmitted, or maybe experimentally they see a little bit of virus in other places, but they have to be bitten by an infected female Culicoides sonorensis, and this is very important here, that has previously fed on an infected viremic animal. So that's how sheep pick up the infection. So after they've been infected, there's an incubation period of around a week, and then they start to show clinical signs. So what are the clinical signs? Sorry, backing up a sec. This disease, is it reportable to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency? Anybody want to hazard a guess? No? It is, and it isn't. It is, except if it's endemic strains. These 5 different strains that are considered endemic in the south and western United States. And so until they know which strain it is, it kind of is reportable. It's kind of in this weird gray bureaucratic zone. So if it is one of the endemic strains, which these cattle were, then it becomes immediately notifiable. Does anybody know what the difference is between reportable and immediately notifiable? No? Haven't learned that? It's so important to you. Reportable means that you have to stop everything and report it to the local CFIA veterinarian in your district. Immediately notifiable is only a laboratory diagnosis, and they have to make a report to the OIE immediately. The OIE being the World Animal Health Organization. So if we think Bluetongue, so as veterinarians, we get a call, and it's always on a Saturday or a Sunday, and the presenting complaint is going to be in sheep. There's lameness, depression, maybe dead sheep. And you're going to go out there going, what the heck is going on? And you're going to call Dr. Jansen. And it's mostly going to be sheep that you're going to be called to. We don't have a lot of farmed deer anymore, but in theory, it could be a farmed deer farm as well. And you're probably not going to get the call to goats. And these are some of the lesions that the OIE has on their webpage, the pictures. And you can see this animal has a lot of necrosis of the face and even edema there. The jaw, it's got a few erosions in the mouth, not too severe in that animal. These animals have very high fevers. So I was lucky or unlucky enough, when I did grad work a number of years ago in California, Bluetongue was endemic, and I saw a lot of Bluetongue cases. And they all had very high fevers. These animals were quite sick. They were very depressed. And they often had the most bizarre edema, usually of the head region, but it could be of the thorax, anywhere on the body. And they are often quite lame. They would hobble, or they would be reluctant to move at all because of the swelling at the coronary band. Now, one can say that all sheep flocks have lame sheep, and I wouldn't argue with you, but this is different. These animals are sick as opposed to just being foot rot. And as I said, erosions in the mouth and tongue. Sometimes their skin sloughs off on their back because of the severe vasculitis. And in an endemic area where the disease or the infection is quite common, you might see significant morbidity, but for fairly low case fatality, maybe only 10%. Well, that's pretty high anyway, 10%. But when you get it into an incursion area where it hasn't been before, we can see very high morbidity and case fatality rates. Be very, very dramatic. So here's some more OIE pictures. I don't know, you really can't appreciate it, but the whole back is just like a hard rock and it's sloughing. Now, the Bluetongue. The Bluetongue is caused because of the severe vasculitis, blocking off all the blood vessels to the tongue, so it appears cyanotic. Not actually that common a sign. So that's, but this coronary band swelling and reddening, and this bizarre facial edema, like I've seen sheep with football ears, very, very odd looking. So that should be an immediate signal to you that maybe you're dealing with Bluetongue. Post-mortem, there's lots of erosion and necrosis lesions throughout the body, esophagus, GI tract. And the pathologists say this is kind of a very classical lesion where on the pulmonary artery there's hemorrhage. Don't know why. Not a pathologist, not going to even pretend to know. But it may not always be there, but it is fairly classical for Bluetongue deaths.
So there's a duck, so it's me.
It's you.
So
See how organized we are?
So what's the insect that transmits this? Paul has already introduced you to the name. It's called, in North America, the vector is considered to be Culicoides sonorensis. They are tiny little flies. That's the end of someone's finger, all right? Sometimes called no-see-ums, because you can't see them, all right? Or biting midges. They're so small, some people believe they can actually go through the meshes we have in our windows, all right? If you look at them under a microscope, if you're not sure, if you see a small insect, could it be Culicoides? Because until very recently, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency considered this did not exist in Canada, all right? And that Paul is going to come back to that issue. So they're tiny, but if you put them under a microscope, you can see this large thorax that's classically referred to as humping over the head, all right? And then very obvious mottled wings. And they feed on blood. Here's females feeding on blood, and it's here, when they take their first feed, that they become infected with the virus, with Bluetongue virus. So, first question is, so if they're going to establish anywhere in Canada, where will it be? Their life cycle involves water, damp areas. They lay eggs, and like any insect, you get larvae that develop that eventually pupate, but the larvae need water. And they particularly like water that contains a lot of organic material. So if you think, for instance, on an average farm, water runoff from manure piles stays in the environment, and that area stays wet or damp. It's a perfect environment. The next thing to notice, once a fly gets infected, it remains infected for life, but its offspring are all uninfected. All right, so the offspring are infected, an infected fly are all born uninfected. All right, but as I said, once they get infected, they remain infected for life. We believe all the adults are killed off with freezing temperatures, which is great in Ontario at the moment, because did we have our first frost last night? Someone told me we did. All right, but within the next few weeks, the climate should kill any adults that might be here. All right, so the following spring, and we believe larvae can overwinter in the environment. When they all hatch, everything that hatches is uninfected. And what happens typically as the summer progresses and those newly hatched flies are feeding on infected animals, the level of virus in this insect population builds and builds to a critical level so that you typically don't see disease until the latter part of the summer, until the fall. All right, so there's a very obvious seasonal distribution to when you see Bluetongue disease. Next thing to note, this fly cannot fly long distances. However, it can be blown massive distances by wind. And Paul is going to come back to that, like hundreds of kilometers, if there's a strong wind, can move the fly. Why is that relevant? Well, very recently, the folks over in Lethbridge, in Alberta, in Ag Canada, did a survey of all the literature. We were considered free of this, but what about the US? They looked at everything that's been published on this particular vector, Culicoides sonorensis, and on the basis of everything's published, this is the distribution at the state level for Culicoides sonorensis. Two things to note. Number one, a lot of the data that went into this map are a few decades old, so some of this information is extremely ancient, so the true distribution really isn't known. But note, this is the part of North America, so the states adjacent to Ontario were particularly considered free. And the last thing to note is, over the years, historically, there's been the odd case of Bluetongue that's occurred in the Okanagan Valley. The only place in Canada where Bluetongue has occurred before is the Okanagan Valley, and it's believed because of the wind blowing Culicoides up into the Okanagan Valley. It never established there. And it was always assumed if there was ever going to be any more Bluetongue diagnosed in Canada, it would obviously be on the West Coast. Well, obviously it was wrong. So, ironically, 2 years ago, researchers at Brock University, so that's just down the road from us, after hearing that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency didn't believe we had the vector anywhere in Canada, thought, let's go and have a look. So this is 2 years ago, all right, way before what happened today, but they wondered, is what the CFIA is saying true, that there are actually no Culicoides sonorensis anywhere in Canada? And they decided to look in the southern part of Ontario. And beginning back in 2013, they went and put traps on 5 sheep farms that basically are on a line from Sarnia to Stony Creek, so down here. Just note, the farm that we're all concerned about is in Chatham, Kent, is down here, all right? But this was 2 years ago. They put traps on 5 sheep farms, and lo and behold, on 3 of the 5 sheep farms, they found Culicoides sonorensis, all right, in large numbers and in 2 seasons. And that's very relevant, because if you find them in 1 season, CFIA would argue, well, they obviously got blown in. But if you go back to the next year and they're still present and in large numbers, it's pretty strong evidence. You've got flies and they've established, and they're living quite happily. So, because of people at Brock University, by 2014, we knew we had Culicoides sonorensis in the province, but we didn't know, and we still don't know, do we actually have the virus circulating in the southern part of the province? So just to remind you, that's where the farm is that everyone's concerned about at the moment. And folks at Brock have trapped these flies in an area further north than that. Paula.
Thank you. So how does Bluetongue virus persist then? We know that sheep that don't die of Bluetongue may stay viremic for several weeks. So they could be a potential source if they are bitten by the Culicoides. But cattle are really considered to be the reservoir. Because they don't show signs of illness usually, at least not with the North American serotypes, they can remain viremic up to 60 days. Now, at some point, the viremia drops down, so they're not effective in infecting Culicoides. The research was at 21 days, they were still infective, and at 49, they weren't. That's why that giant range. So we kind of, infer that maybe around a month, maybe these animals can remain infective for about 30 days to Culicoides. So you can imagine then how they can serve as a reservoir and build up the virus in the Culicoides sonorensis population. So that's what has traditionally been found in other places. Other ruminants like goats and deer or pronghorn antelope or all those have been less well studied, and the researchers think it's probably shorter, but no one knows for sure. So how would the virus overwinter? So obviously in warmer climes, then it is possible for the adult Culicoides females to survive. But here in Ontario, or most of Canada, how the heck would the virus overwinter? We know, as Andrew said, the adults will die, the larvae will survive, but the virus is not transmitted vertically to them. Could the virus overwinter in ruminants? Well, I'd love to say that our winters were only 30 days long, but I don't think you'd believe me. So it doesn't appear likely. So how would the virus come back? Anybody want to hazard a guess? How could the virus come back into Ontario after winter? Yes?
I couldn't totally off. Does it last longer in deer?
Well, they don't know for sure, but they don't think so.
Okay.
They don't think so. Anybody? Yes?
Migrating deer, so they're going back and forth.
Possibly. Now, I am no wildlife expert, but apparently this kills deer quite effectively. So one should expect that probably they don't move very far, but you don't know. Yes? Wind again, absolutely. Yes? Oh, maybe. Maybe there's another reservoir we're not sure of, because you never say never, right? We don't believe there is, but also cattle moving up from the US. And I'll get to that in a second. It could be that cattle will bring it back. So, Bluetongue in the federal government. Prior to 2006, all Bluetongue serotypes were reportable, which meant that if you suspected there was Bluetongue, you had to drop everything and report it to the government. Otherwise, they'd put you in prison. I'm just kidding there, but you know, there might be other consequences. But the other thing is that the government was obliged to try and prevent its introduction from enzootic areas. So for years and years and nauseating years, every cattle beast that came into Canada had to be serologically negative for Bluetongue. So that was a huge cost to people exporting cattle into Canada or importing cattle into Canada. It would be the exporters usually that bore the cost. So they modified that and said, well, we own cattle are only viremic for about 30 days. So let's say that we don't, and the whole of the US doesn't have Bluetongue. So if the cattle came out of, say, Pennsylvania or New York, they don't need to be tested. And if they come out of Oregon or California, well, then if they come up in the winter or non-transmission months, then they're probably okay. And they like that, but they still had to be tested at all other times of the year. And then cattle feeders were still not happy. They complained, believe it or not, to the government, I think fairly continuously and loudly, particularly those in Western Canada. So the CFIA decided to do a risk assessment, which was published in 2006. And they decided that Canada was a low risk for Bluetongue establishing in any meaningful way, even if the cattle did bring the virus in. They said in Eastern Canada, we don't have the vector. Can't get it this far north. There was this magic, what they called the sonorensis line, which is 40 degrees. We sit here at 44, therefore there's no way we can have the vector, therefore we can't have Bluetongue. They did find some evidence of sonorensis occasionally in Western Canada, but they said, look, it's not, you were never going to get transmission here because look, Montana doesn't have any issues. So this was in 2006. So the other part, which is actually in the risk assessment, so it isn't just me here saying here, is that at that time, the Canadian government was trying to get older cattle back into the US because of BSE. Remember, over 30 months, cattle couldn't go. And so they were trying to, I think, do a little bit of dealing here. You know, we'll do this for you if you do this for us. And they actually stated they were concerned that, you know, if they keep stopping cattle from coming north without a Bluetongue test, then maybe the US wouldn't allow older cattle into the US. So the sheep industry kind of became the sacrificial lamb to the cattle feeders in that regard. So
You said it would get racy.
It's true though. I mean, this is sometimes the way things happen in animal health. So when they did the risk assessment, they asked for people's input. I know I wrote a letter to the Minister of Agriculture of the day, which I think they just filed in the garbage. But they actually told the sheep industry they weren't interested in what they had to say, because they knew the sheep industry were against this whole thing. And so faced with that information, the Canadian Sheep Federation says, okay, what are we going to do? We don't know whether Bluetongue is going to come north. We don't believe the risk assessment. And so they had to figure out what they were going to do to protect their producers. Now, when a disease is reportable, if there is a disease outbreak, then government will give the producer money for their losses and for control programs. So there's a big cost to the government if there is a disease outbreak. And I won't say anything about cost-cutting measures and trying to save the government money. I'm sure that never figured into any decision they had. But so the sheep industry says, well, we got to have some kind of system. If a producer has, 40% mortality and 80% morbidity in their flock, that could put them out of business. So they developed an insurance program, a private insurance program through an insurance company, so they could pay a yearly premium, and then they would, if Bluetongue came into their flocks and they had losses, then they would have some money come back. The cattle industry says, see how benevolent we are. For a few years, we'll put up $250,000. Well, in this case, it was 2008, and that expired. So there is now no cattleman's money if there is Bluetongue. The insurance company decided they didn't want to offer it anymore, this program. And when the Canadian sheep industry went to the insurance company a couple of weeks ago, they were not interested. I mean, why would an insurance company offer a program they know was going to be cashed in on, right? Sorry, I didn't say that, did I?
It's getting a bit.
So no insurance program, no company interested in offering an insurance program, and no cattlemen's money if we do have an outbreak. Producers are on their own. So just because, you know, when you say that there's no risk in Montana, the very next year, this is what happened in northern Montana, just a few months after the CSF developed the insurance program. This came to within 3 counties of Alberta. There was a huge Bluetongue outbreak in lots of flocks, lots of dead animals, because this was considered an incursion area. So just that's the way biology works. The other thing, of course, that was happening at the same time is Europe. In the summer of 2006, on a farm in the Netherlands, a veterinarian, I think it was on a Sunday, of course, went out and diagnosed Bluetongue in a flock. No other animals around there, no expectation that Bluetongue would be there. It just showed up. Nobody still knows where it came from. This strain of Bluetongue, Bluetongue 8, also causes disease in cattle, not a severe, but clinically significant disease. So the other thing was they all said, oh, there's no way you can get Bluetongue in Europe because you don't have the vector. Does this sound familiar? Well, not only did they find the vector, but they also showed that that other Chilocoides species could carry the virus. So just when you say can't happen because of this, then biology changes things. So eventually, to control it, they had to very, very quickly develop a vaccine, and they vaccinated thousands and thousands of animals. And right now, they're having another outbreak with Bluetongue 8 in France, and they're trying to quarantine animals and vaccinate. That's the only thing they can do right now to control it. So it appears that Bluetongue incursions into Europe are now becoming a more commonplace thing. We have outbreaks in Hungary and Croatia. We have outbreaks in Spain. Well, Spain's always been an issue, but also into Italy and Greece, causing tons of animal losses and cost. So here's just some maps. In 1997, I don't know if you can appreciate, there's a dark blue line here, goes up a little bit into Spain. That was in 1997, they said, Chilocoides imicola, which is the vector in Europe, couldn't go further north than that. But in 2005, it was now covering most of Italy and part of Greece and Turkey. So it had gone north. Shortly thereafter, just a few years after there's the Bluetongue 8, which showed up in the UK, and even as far north as Norway, which is like where it showed up was like 56 or 57 degrees north. And since then, there's been lots of other strains, lots of bleeding maps showing, 4 and 2, and now an unknown one showing up in Hungary again, an unknown strain. So what's the current role of the CFIA? As Dr. Peregrine said, in order to prove to the OIE that Canada is Bluetongue free, they were obliged to test 3,000 animals a year. It's the same thing as they do for Brucella abortus. And if positive, then they need to know whether it's an indigenous strain, one of those 5, or was it one of the, was it Bluetongue 8 or one of the Caribbean strains, or serotypes, I should say. If it's an indigenous serotype, then their job is done. That's it. That's their responsibility. Now, they may have research desires, but regulatory, that's it. So now it's you.
So at the end of the day, what does this now mean, firstly, for the dairy and beef cattle industries in Canada? Really not much. All right, serotype 13 appears to be almost non-pathogenic in cattle. All right, so as far as impacting the health of dairy and beef cattle in Canada, there shouldn't be likely any impact whatsoever. What about export markets? Well, as someone in CFIA said to me, well, since the primary export markets for cattle products are the US and Mexico, who are endemic for this Bluetongue anyway, it's really not going to impact that at all, which is true. So we can export quite happily to Bluetongue endemic countries. The issue is we no longer can export cattle products to any country that's free. And the thing that probably concerns most would be semen and embryo export. Now, there are possibilities for the Canadian government to negotiate specific exemptions on an individual country basis, but that is yet to happen. At the moment, all export of cattle products to Bluetongue-free countries is now not permitted. So, health of cattle in Canada really isn't an issue. Deer populations. This is the other species that appears to be exquisitely susceptible. So the virus is highly pathogenic in deer. Fortunately, we don't farm sizable numbers of deer. However, we have a sizable wild deer population. And so there are concerns, what could be the impact on those? Goats, fortunately, it produces a relatively mild disease. The big concern, as I think you've already gathered from Paula, it's the sheep industry that's most concerned because of this high morbidity and mortality. Paula mentioned vaccines. There have been vaccines developed in other parts of the world, but they're strain specific. So theoretically, you could develop a vaccine for this virus. Is there enough concern out there for a company to be prepared to put up the money? And I should think that's something Jocelyn's looking at the moment. All right? Is there enough out there to justify vaccine development? Remember this picture. If you're a small ruminant producer, this disease should terrify you. What are the next steps, Paula?
No, that's me. Okay, so this is, Dr. Jansen is in charge or coordinating a culicoides trapping program right now. And you have them on 10 farms? 11 sheep and cattle farms in southwestern Ontario. And it's happening right now. So we don't know whether the frost is going to affect their success rate.
Picked up yesterday morning.
And did they find anything?
I don't know if you guys had time to go through them yet.
Okay. And we certainly want to continue that. We want to know the distribution across Ontario of where this vector is. We also want to test whether the virus is there. And it's done by PCR. And so in previous years, the 2013 and 14, those samples are sitting in a freezer. They're going to get tested as well as the ones collected this autumn. But because cattle that are out grazing are going to be the most likely probably to show us infection without any evidence of disease, then a serologic survey of beef cattle across the province. Of course, we have to know whether these beef cattle have traveled or not. We have to know where the farms are. We have to know a lot about the geography of the area if we want to determine risk factors for infection. And testing white-tailed deer is a little more problematic. They don't stand too well while you take a blood sample. But Dr. Nicole Nemeth in pathobiology thinks that she can work with hunters to try and get some blood samples from hunted deer, just to try and see seroprevalence. There is another virus very similar to Bluetongue, which is also in the US, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which at this point we have not diagnosed in Ontario, which I can't believe we haven't. And she would also be looking for evidence of that. And again, it's really important that we know whether the pattern changes year over year, and to see whether it's becoming endemic or whether it was just a one-off weirdo thing. And of the 3,000 cattle they tested, they found the only infected bovines in Canada this year. But, I don't know, I doubt that.
But you have to appreciate picking it up on a random sample is a bit of a concern.
Well,
if it's randomly picked up.
Yeah, you probably have to have a lot of animals infected to find that one positive. That would be, most epidemiologists would agree with that. I think all of them would. So if we find that it's widespread, then will we see disease in sheep? Are we going to see disease in sheep? Have we missed it? I mean, we've been trying to educate producers and veterinarians about the signs. Should we invest in developing a vaccine? Because it's a very expensive proposition with a very low number of vials that will be sold to recoup any costs associated with it. If it's low prevalence, then for sure we should continue to monitor. And we're open for questions
That's
now.
everything we wanted to say.
But Jocelyn, is there something you'd like to add at all?
Well, that I have sent an email to the specialist in CFIA to ask some questions regarding serotypes, and are certain serotypes more likely to cause a problem with certain species like 17 in deer, we think, and is there changes in the strain from year to year which will affect pathogenicity, and also to confirm or deny the comment made by someone in CFIA that serotype 13 is, it may be difficult to infect sheep with serotype 13. So that's a big question that needs to be answered, but someone has put that out there. I just need to find a reference. I want them to put that in writing.
I have never read that, but.
I've never read that either, but that was what we were told, and so now I'm going to backtrack to the person I think will know.
Oh, that's very good news if that's true.
But
It still doesn't mean that other serotypes can't come
or that
in.
other strains from year to year,
Yeah.
it could be different. So.
The other thing, the other slide that I thought I'd put in this presentation but clearly didn't, was a very recently published paper from August where they've done a sonorensis, look for sonorensis in Montana and Alberta, and they certainly have found it just up to Calgary in a lot of their traps.
And they predict in that paper is that it will, by 2050, the Culicoides vector will be as far as Edmonton, which is the 54th parallel.
If you look at all the climate change predictions, particularly for this part of North America over the next 50 years, it's almost certain that the Culicoides species that are in the US will move into Canada on a substantive basis. Any questions? Yes.
I guess I'm just curious why so the strain 13 is known to be indigenous here, or like based on the last or the history. If that's the
Here being western and southwest US, not indigenous to Canada.
right.
Yeah.
So the US has always had the 5 serotypes, all right? They've had them for many years, since the early 50s. We haven't, right? That's the big difference.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Jeff?
With these recent incursions into Montana, are the U.S. not motivated to develop a vaccine?
So there's a Bluetongue 10 vaccine that Colorado Serum makes. And did you talk to them, or it was Jennifer McTavish from Ontario's Sheep Marketing Agency talked to them, and they had absolutely no interest in any vaccine development. The California wool growers have developed strain-specific Bluetongue vaccines and tried, many years ago when I was there, it was always the game to guess what serotype was going to be most prominent and then try and get the right vaccine into the animals, and sometimes they guessed wrong, which is why I got to see lots of Bluetongue. But they, as far as I know, they don't have a 10, and I don't know why. But regardless, they can only sell that within the state on their regulations. The USDA isn't very interested in Bluetongue per se. It's a state issue. And so getting data, prevalence data, is extremely difficult, and there's been some recent papers that have tried to accumulate all the sources, but it depends whether the state looks, and then reports what they find. So the surveillance is pretty low quality.
Any other questions? Yes.
If you use the vaccines that they use in Southern Africa,
So-
do you get any cross protection?
So, well, the reason I'm laughing, the question is if you use some of the South African vaccines. So there's not a lot of cross protection, but the reason I laughed is that one of the things that happened in this Bluetongue 8 outbreak in Europe was they suddenly started to see all these South African strains popping up. And they figured that somebody illegally brought in the vaccine. It's a modified live, not pathogenic when you use it in an endemic area, but apparently pathogenic when you bring it into Europe. So that's why I was laughing. So no, we would not do that. Yeah, it's a problem because there doesn't seem to be any cross protection. Yeah.
Any other questions? I thought I'd just tell you, we found out the other day, so this is something you won't find publicly available, but the CFIA, we found out in the last year, has started trapping activities right across Canada, certainly from Ontario right through to the East Coast. So the question I asked them was, why are you doing that if you remove Bluetongue from the reportable list because you said there wasn't a risk. So it's interesting that within the last year, CFIA has started its own trapping. I think, I kept saying, why would you do that if, in light of the fact you said it wasn't a risk? Maybe they're prepared to do a U-turn on this. Culicoides do also transmit many other nasty pathogens. So they are actually also establishing expertise in Culicoides identification, which they admitted they'd lost historically. So
I don't think they'll take it back. They're going to downregulate more,
okay.
but that they're trying to at least stay educated
Yeah.
on it. Is, I guess, a good thing.
There's been a number of reportable diseases that the CFIA has in very recent years downregulated. That's the one way of saying it. So Bluetongue is rabies, anaplasmosis, and anthrax. So it saves the federal government lots of money, but it doesn't necessarily do much for disease control. Did I say that out loud?
Okay. So this is rapidly going off the rails. Does anyone have any other questions? If not, please feel free to contact Paul or myself or Jocelyn or anyone in the small room area. I'm sure they'd be more than willing to answer your questions.
Yeah, we don't know what next year holds. It could hold nothing. It could disappear, or we could continue to see more and more incursions as you go out and practice and deal with them. Thanks.
Thank you.